Good afternoon, class. My name is Craig Yarborough, and I'm going to be teaching the class for you today. We're going to be working on Chapter 14. So if you will, make sure you turn into your books on page 441, and we're going to start talking about the issues that you're going to have between the time that you begin the process of contract and getting you to closing. Before we go there, I just want to do a quick review of the fact that in the last few days that we've already talked about the sales contracts and concepts, and we've already talked about the preparation procedures for your contracts and get to where we are today. Have you got any questions about anything that we've talked about the previous couple of days?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, if not, we're going to go ahead and jump right into Chapter 14. We're going to be talking on page 441. And the first thing that you do, now remember, we are already at contract stage. You have signed all the paperwork, all of that is behind you, and now what you're doing is going to begin working with your client and getting to the closing table with the attorney. So we're good this far. Okay. The one thing that you need to make sure you do at this point is a lot of your buyers are going to be first-time home buyers. Some of them have already had the experience of buying one or multiple homes. But again, they may not be experienced into exactly what's happening in North Carolina, how the process works, what we do here, and in some cases, they may just not remember. So you need to make sure you educate your client for as far as what the next few weeks, month is going to entail for as far as getting them from the contract to the closing table as well as your sellers. What is a closing? The closing is the culmination of all the transfer of title and from the seller to the buyer. That is basically your closing. So what we want to do is we want to get to where we're settling. And we know there's a process to get from the contract to the settlement table. The first thing it is the completion of the title update. You've got to have the permission from the lender in order to fund and disperse loan funds. And you've got to make sure that then there's the actual closing. How many of you know there's a difference in the settlement and the closing? We all know that, correct?
Yes.
Settlement is where you go into the attorney's office, you sit down, you sign all your loan documents with your buyer. And then the closing is after all of that is done and they send this paperwork back. Then the lender has to approve it, they do all of their stuff, and then they can fund the note, and then the attorney can record. And there's a process that he has to do before he actually does the final recording so he can disperse funds. And that, after the title is done and the recording is done, then it is closed. And at that point, the seller can receive their funds and the buyer can move into the house. Okay. The first thing that you're going to do after you go under contract is select an attorney. Are we all good with selecting an attorney? We all know that there are different attorneys in town. What is the one thing that you want to make sure of when you're dealing with real estate? Try to make sure you choose a real estate attorney. Sometimes your buyers may know an attorney, but they don't specialize in real estate. And then that can be a process for as far as holding up closing because if they choose the wrong attorney and they don't really know what they're doing to get to the final table. So make sure they use a licensed attorney that is familiar with real estate, that specializes in real estate. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a buyer client who asked if they could use a title company to close their loan.
Okay. Did y'all hear what Jack had? Okay. Jack is asking whether or not a title company can close loans in North Carolina.
They said they used one from where they were from.
In North Carolina, we actually prefer to say that we are an attorney closing state, and that is what we base our closings on, but they do allow, there are opportunities for a closing title company to do the closing. There are things that have to make sure that happen for as far as the title company. One is the fact that a paralegal is going to do the closing. An attorney has to be on staff. The attorney is the one who actually has to discuss any legal processes, anything for as far as the transfer and the ownership of the property. But a paralegal is allowed to come in and do the closing, so long as the attorney is on staff and can answer any legal questions. Any other questions about pre-selecting your attorney? Well, I've got one. You ready? Who knows the attorneys? You do. You're the broker. You're the one who's been doing the closing, working with your buyers and finding homes. So most buyers are not going to have any idea for as far as who you use to close a loan. And they're going to ask you for recommendations. Can you do that? Absolutely. You're allowed to recommend an attorney that you may have a relationship with, that you can get your property closed. You can give them a list of 2 or 3 attorneys. The one thing that you've got to make sure of is the fact that if you recommend an attorney, do not be taking kickbacks. Kickbacks are illegal. You cannot take referral fees from an attorney for referring business to them. So keep that in mind, make sure that everything is legit and on the up and up whenever you refer attorneys. The other thing is, what do you have to give the attorney? You've now chosen the person that you want to close the loan for your buyer. So what paperwork do you have to give them? What do you have to furnish them?
The contract.
Offer to purchase and contract. First thing, make sure the attorney gets the offer to purchase and contract. Make sure that the lender should get it, but you need to make sure that the attorney gets it immediately. And why? Who else is closing loans? Probably about another 1,500 agents in our area. So they're all trying to fight for attorneys and getting on their schedules to close. So what you want to do is, as soon as you get your contract, is you want to make sure that you choose an attorney, you send it to the attorney, and you schedule a closing date and a time. Make sure that's one of the first things that you do. Now, keep in mind that all closings can be delayed. Just because you've gone on the calendar for this date does not mean that you're going to hit that date. There's any number of reasons that can come up. A lot of times the loan could be delayed. Sometimes there could be an issue with the funding from the buyer, or maybe they're getting funds from a parent on certain loans. And yes, all this has to be ironed out and make sure that anything can be cause the loan or the closing to be delayed. So you want to make sure that you're setting a date and a time, knowing that it's a tentative date. It is not set in stone. The other thing you want to do is you got to make sure that they get the contact information for all the sellers and the buyers. Usually the attorneys are going to send you a sheet that actually has buyer's info, seller's info, and that's up to you to make sure it gets completed and returned to them. Make sure at this point all we're doing is collecting information from our buyer or our seller to give to the attorney, but you want to make sure that you are not getting their personal, private information. Do not take social security numbers. Do not get their loan information. You need to make sure that you give the attorney the contact information, or you give the buyer and the seller the contact information for whatever attorney, because sellers don't always use the buyer's attorney. They can use their own attorney to prepare their deeds and work directly with them. I was there saying most cases. In our area, the buyer's attorney does both. But you've got to make sure that you're not the one collecting information. Why? Any questions? Nobody has any idea why?
Data breach.
Data breaches. We're all aware that in the last few years that emails are hacked. There are people out there hacking into attorneys' accounts and getting their information. I know that there are cases where attorneys have actually wiring information to us, And then normally we would forward that email to our buyers so that they get the wiring information and where to wire it to. The problem is the fact that they're good. Crooks are good. And they're going to sit there and they can maneuver and change one letter, one anything, and recreate a new email address and set up an offshore account somewhere, and your client wires money to that account, it's gone. So make sure that any of that information that we allow to be communicated directly from the buyer and the attorney, the seller and the attorney, and all you do is you're furnishing contact information so that they can reach out to them. I will tell you that my preference and the one that I like is what I ask my clients to do is that when they're getting ready to wire money, is that they're at the bank and that they actually have the teller call the attorney's office and verify the wiring information before they do the final transfer. Most attorneys are going to send an engagement letter to the buyer and introduce themselves. And in that engagement letter, a lot of times they do include wiring information, so the buyer will have it. But it's still not bad that at that final stage, before that money is done, that they reach out and just verify those numbers. Because the last thing you want them to do is wire $5,000, $10,000, $400,000 for a closing and find out that their money didn't end up where it was supposed to. So just make sure you're the one that can work with them, but you're the one that's limiting the liability of all parties losing their money. Make sure it gets to where it's supposed to. What information do you provide the attorney? We talked about it. Whenever you do your inspections and so forth, what are we going to do? We got to make sure that anything that we collect during the process, if they need to make sure they get invoices for all the seller paid costs that they've done, because you want to make sure they've been invoiced and they're paid for. You want to make sure that they get copies of the inspection reports. You got to make sure they get all the buyer loan information. You want all the costs to be paid by the buyer at closing versus the seller paid. So you got to make sure that the attorney gets all of these invoices. You got to set up your date that we already talked about. Now, some attorneys are going to tell you they do not want every document. It's up to you to provide the documents and let them work with the buyers and the sellers for as far as how they're handling that. We want everything to be on the closing disclosure because it shows that it's been paid and taken care of. And you need to follow up when you get your closing disclosure to make sure that these are on there and they've all been paid. Due diligence period. So now we know what we got to furnish the attorney. We know all this information. So now we are in the process of our due diligence. On due diligence, if you look in your book, we're starting on page 443 for the due diligence process. We need to be the one to educate our buyers. You know, there are inspections and some buyers say, I don't want any inspection. Is that a good idea?
No.
No. It is not a good idea, and definitely we do not need to be the ones as brokers to recommend to any buyer that you don't need an inspection. Now there is a form, there's an addendum that's in our box that we use, and it is a, what is it called? It's the, what form am I looking for? Professional services disclosure form. Make sure that you fill that form out and make sure you have your buyer and your seller initial that they accept or deny or reject. You want to make sure that you are protected, because if you recommended that they do an inspection or you recommended that they do, you know, for as far as their insurance, anything, and they say no, you want it on there that they have chosen not to do so. So make sure you have that form done. It is only there, it protects everybody. If you ever have a year down the road and your buyer comes back up and says they have a problem with a pest inspection, they've got termites, and you say, wait a minute, you said you didn't want a termite inspection. You recommended it. You got the sheet to prove that you at least asked them to do one and they said no. So please make sure that you do all of these things here. The other thing is, you gotta make sure that their loan, during their due diligence process, are they gonna be 100% approved for their loan? Typically not. We all know that. We know their loans are not gonna get approved during the few weeks of due diligence. But during that few weeks, besides the inspections and besides the things that they gotta do, we also know that they have got to make sure that their appraisal is done. They need to make sure that as much of that loan that can be approved is approved. They need to make sure they are on track to do this. And it's up to you to educate the buyers and the sellers of this process. You know, stay in touch with them, work with them, call them. What else did we do during this time frame? We talked about material facts. What material facts? Anybody got ideas what are material facts that we need to discuss with our buyers and sellers?
Anything that needs improvement or repair?
That's gonna come up under the inspection report. Y'all hear what Manny was asking for as far as the inspection and repairs? That's good, but that's not the material fact that we're looking for.
Polybutylene piping?
Polybutylene piping is polybutylene piping, we'll talk about that later, but that is one of them, polybutylene piping. What else?
The tank.
Oil tanks, good one. What else?
Roof leaks.
Roof leaks show up in the inspection, but that's good. What else? What about lead? Is lead a material fact? What about asbestos? What about synthetic stucco?
Oh, yeah.
Synthetic stucco, okay? So we know that these are things that they need to be prepared for. And then what else when they doing their loan, the process, they're beginning their loan, what do? They have to complete their application, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the beginning, before you got to contract, before you started showing your buyers homes, they went in and either they got pre-qualified or pre-approved for their loan. So they were probably looking at a particular loan. Now they got a house under contract. Is the house there the one that they've chosen? Maybe once they got into it and the lender started running their credits, they verified all the numbers, maybe that loan is not the best loan for them. And so now all of a sudden they're looking at different interest rates. They're looking at several different factors. Now they're in their due diligence process. So you need to be prepared and help them. Shop around for loans. Don't ever just say, oh, that's fine, you got the best loan out there, because you don't know. I'm not a mortgage broker. I know that there are loans out there sometimes for people that are better than the ones that they've already gone in and gotten approved for. I'll tell you a big one. It just came up with me yesterday showing a buyer a home. They didn't even know that he qualified for a VA loan. I mean, he was in the Coast Guard for 8 years. And he is disabled through the Coast Guard. And he went and got approved for an FHA loan. Well, that's great. But why in the world wouldn't they at least check to see about VA? He's disabled. And you know that means he doesn't have to pay funding fees. There's no ILMI on VA. So that could increase their purchasing power. There's a lot of things. Now he needs to go in and find out if he does qualify for the VA loan. But the point is the fact that I needed to tell him once I found he was in the Coast Guard. And this just came up in conversation while we were looking at houses. Because I didn't know them. It's the first time we had met. They just told me they would qualify for FHA. And they showed me a letter and we went with it. So during the conversation when we're looking at property, he talks about the fact that he was in the Coast Guard, and that threw up a flag, and I said, well, we need to talk about this. And that's what you need to do whenever you get in there and you start talking to your buyers. Make sure that they shop around and get the best loan that's available for them.
How many mortgage lenders would you say to offer? 2 or 3?
That could vary. I mean, sometimes you may have one that you really like to work with because they work well with you and you know they get it, that's fine. They've already got probably one that they've already dealt with,
Okay,
so if you choose one other one, that's fine.
okay,
So long as you're not getting anything back, they're not giving you referral fees.
right,
My recommendation would be at least 2,
okay.
sometimes 3, that you send them to and let them talk to. What they're gonna do is normally, and I'm not gonna say in all cases, I had one that talked, probably 4 different lenders in town. That's fine. She had to get happy with whoever she chose.
Is there really a big difference between the mortgage lenders?
There are some lenders that have, I don't want to use the term, but it's basically they have what they call, this is our loan qualifications.
Okay,
And if you fall anywhere outside that norm, they either cannot do the loan or it's a much higher interest rate, different things that they use to qualify you.
okay.
So I would always shop around for a loan. I would always call at least 2 or 3 different ones just to ask them, this is, you've got to make sure you're honest with them though and make sure you give them the same criteria. Don't call one and say, I've got a 700 credit score and call somebody else and tell me I got a 640.
Right.
There's a difference. So you got to make sure that you're accurate on your income. So once you get that information, then you can pretty much, know which lender you want to be with. I can tell you that most of them are going to go see 1, maybe 2, and after the second one, they've made a decision on who they wish to use. But you need to make sure that you know what loan and that it's the appropriate loan for them. There are still loan brokers out there, mortgage brokers, that will gouge somebody.
Okay.
So just make sure. Home inspections. Give me a list of home inspections. What are home inspections that you think right now that your client should be getting?
Termite inspection
Termite. Another one,
for zoning.
zoning,
HVAC.
HVAC. What's that gonna fall under?
Air
Usually you're gonna get a home inspection that's gonna turn up any of those things to check out.
A survey.
So home inspections are definitely surveys.
Appraisal?
Big one.
The appraisal should be done during that process, yes.
Septic if they have it.
Septic, that's a big one, we're gonna talk about that one later. Anything else?
Easements.
Easements?
Is that when they start looking for insurance during the
They should
inspection?
start, absolutely, not during, that's not an inspection.
Right. but
That's
should
during
they
their due
start-
diligence period that they're gonna check around for insurance.
And how are they gonna know if they need to look for flood insurance? Or homeowners and or flood?
One is that should come up with you because that's part of our due diligence is making sure that we check and verify for as far as covenants restrictions and for as far as are they in a flood zone, not in a flood zone, what type of insurance they need. Because a lot of, if they're in a condos, townhomes, you gotta verify townhomes because some townhomes are under HOAs, some are not. Condos typically are all having an HOA. So you gotta make sure that for as far as those, and then there's different policies that come into play for as far as your HOAs and your condos and townhomes. And flood insurance is if you're in a flood zone, and you all know that we just got remapped.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not approved yet, but you know that typically that map's gonna get approved, and it's gonna start pretty soon. So we ought to make sure that we know that flood map, because there are a lot of properties that we may have listed today that are not in the flood zone, but in a month and a half from now, they will be in a flood zone. So we have to just make sure that these are things that we follow up with and make sure that they are or not, because whether or not there's a current flood policy in place can determine how much money your buyer will pay. Because right now, they're subsidized and they're transferable from the seller to the buyer.
Right,
But if the seller didn't have a flood policy, he paid cash for the house,
right.
he may not have gotten a flood policy. So you just need to do that. But that stuff, yes, that's gonna come up during the due diligence period, and so forth. Not necessarily part of your inspection, but yes.
How often does the flood map change? Often?
It hasn't really changed in several years now. I would say it's been 5, 6 years.
Okay, so this newest one we should be able to stick with,
It'll be in place for a while,
okay.
at least until we have another major hurricane that floods New Hanover County, but, yeah. Anytime that you have major storms and they have lots of flooding, that's when you're gonna see them coming out and looking at flood. Any other inspections that y'all can think about?
Like well or water?
Well, water, yes.
Radon?
Radon, that's big now. We need to make sure we check on radon.
I haven't heard of any problems with radon. Does that happen a lot here on the coast?
It's kind of interesting that you talk about it because I can tell y'all for years, I've always been told radon's not a big deal here, and because we're on flat land.
Yeah.
But in the last few years, there's been several cases of reported radon poisoning.
What?
And so now, definitely one that you want to mention to your client that they should consider getting.
Okay.
Make sure, don't just say, oh, no, we're on the coast, we don't need radon. I had a house up in the mountains of North Carolina. I didn't even do it then. I thought radon was just sort of a, but I'm from here. I never even thought about radon gas, and nobody up there recommended that I get one. Well, we discovered there was radon gas, so we had to have them come in and put the line pipe in and do it. Now, testing for radon
Uh-huh.
is not hard, but there's several different ways of doing it. There's a short term, which is usually a 2 to 3 day process.
Okay.
And then there's one that's a little bit longer that can take anywhere from a week and longer. And then there's some, there's several different ones. The main thing is usually during your due diligence process and closings, the one that you're going to usually recommend is going to be the short term,
Okay.
where you do 2 to 3 days. So you just need to make sure you reach out, find somebody who can do the
Yeah,
radon
is it a separate
inspection.
contractor that does the radon?
There's some here in Wilmington, there's some in Raleigh that'll come in and do them.
Okay.
You just need to reach out, know, and have them come in. That's something that the buyer's gonna handle and take care of
Okay.
as far as that. So we already talked about the survey, we talked about property insurance. And know that in today's practice, that is something that the buyer, you really need to do during your due diligence process. There are issues that can arise with insurance, and even though all properties can get insurance, sometimes the property based on age, based on renovations, it could be a higher priced policy. So in their loan, they may have been priced that this is how much they're anticipating insurance is going to cost, but it can be higher, so that might throw them out of qualifying.
Okay.
When you combine that, the cost of their monthly expenses. The other thing is believe it or not, there are some buyers out there that have made so many claims on property that your buyer may be uninsurable through an insurance company. So you just need to make sure that they have gone through this and make sure that during the due diligence process, especially we talk about termites, definitely do that. Do you need to worry about termite inspections if the house is under a bond?
Yes.
Yes. Definitely don't, just because the house is under a bond, doesn't mean there aren't any. I mean, there was one just recently that I know the house was under a bond, it was transferred, and when we did it, the seller or selling agent listing agent called and said, we have a bond, it's transferable. They were just out there, sent me a copy of an invoice where they were out there 2 weeks before contract. We still sent an inspector out there, and they found active termites.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So all they do typically when they go out, they walk around, they may spray, but they're not doing thorough checks. So sometimes you just need to make sure that you do the pest inspection. They're not expensive, but they're worth every dollar. Leases, that's another inspection. It's not really an inspection. What do you need to do? You're buying a property there's currently a tenant in place. And you know that leases, if they're 3 years or less, don't have to be in writing. They still have to be honored. Correct?
Yeah.
So if you have a tenant in place and they're under a lease, you gotta find out how long is that lease in play for. You gotta find out if they're month to month, whether or not they're gonna move out. If you're transferring the lease that they're currently in, make sure that all this paperwork is done. The attorney helps with this and make sure that all these leases are transferred. So all these things come up. Any repairs that the seller has done on the house, what do you want?
Receipts.
Paid invoices. You want to make sure that all this stuff has been paid for so that they don't attach a lien on the property.
Oh, okay.
So you want to make sure that all this is handled, taken care of during the time. Septic systems, Nancy mentioned those earlier. Why septic systems?
You have to pull the permit, right?
The big thing with septic systems is the fact that the people that were living in a house, and maybe even these people, it was like this when they moved in, but the big thing with septic systems is somebody could have converted a garage to a bedroom.
Right.
They could be using a bonus room and counting it as a bedroom, but if they're on a septic system, they gotta make sure that they went through the health department, make sure that their septic system is capable of handling that extra bedroom. Because we're concerned about bedrooms, not necessarily how many people are living in a house, because water HUD standards, 2 heartbeats per bedroom. So if you have a 4-bedroom house and they're looking at now 8 people living in that house, and you've got a permit for a septic system that has 3-bedroom house, so they're looking at 6, can that septic system be overloaded?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. You also have to verify whether or not it's a municipal system or whether or not it's a community system. Community systems are based on how many homes are being built in that neighborhood and what the bedrooms were when the builders were building those houses. So a lot of times you can go into an area that says this is how much, this is the area, and this is what it's built for, and then if they start converting, you can overpower their community system. So you need to make sure that the property is capable of handling whatever bedrooms. But you might have to go back to the seller during your due diligence period and what? Renegotiate. Because all of a sudden, you don't have a 4-bedroom house, you got a 3-bedroom house. So during your due diligence process, what do you get to do? Renegotiate. So you can handle all of this during that time. Wells and water quality. If you got a well, you want to make sure that you test the water. I would recommend they test the water to find out what's in the water and make sure that it all meets all standards. Some loans, a lot of times VA, they have guidelines that have to be met, and they may want you to get a water test as they do with septic. So you just need to make sure that you know what type of loan you're doing and whether or not that particular loan is going to require one. But you should always have those tested. Because what are we running into in New Hanover County? Gen X. Now currently Gen X is not a material fact. There's no given proof that Gen X causes any issues, but you want to be aware and stay abreast and know when things change. Environmental. We talked about lead. We mentioned radon. Radon, I cannot even begin to tell you how important this one is now. Because I bought my house, I bought it 20 years ago, so of course radon probably then, nobody even thought about radon being important. And over the last several years, it's not one that I went out of my way to recommend that people get, but I never told them not to. But the point is now, I recommend that everybody get a radon test. Because one is, what does it cause? Radon causes cancer.
Oh, cause, I thought it said cost.
And it's an odorless gas.
It is
so-
odorless,
So you don't
so
know.
you have no idea, and it causes cancer. So you want to make sure that your client has a radon test. Right. Asbestos, we live in an historic area, so what else do we have? Asbestos. We have a lot of asbestos siding on homes in the historical area. The thing to always keep in mind with asbestos, as long as you leave it alone, it's fine. It's only if you break it, you start tearing it apart, and we use the word friable, means airborne. Is it dangerous? So make sure that you go through and make sure you disclose anything for as far as the asbestos and what to do or what to, how to handle it. Make sure you review all your covenants and restrictions with your buyers. You should by now, during your due diligence process, make sure you get a packet. Go online, you can find them. Sometimes they're real thin, sometimes they're real thick, based on the neighborhood. So just make sure that you go over covenants and restrictions, make sure they're happy with them. There's a neighborhood in our area right now that I've had buyers that moved into the area. I gave them copies of the covenants and restrictions. They read through them, they were happy with them. But they didn't know that they couldn't plant petunias in the yard, that they had to get all flowers approved. So they didn't fall under the approved flowers of the HOA, and they were found out they loved petunias. They couldn't use them. They actually planted them in their yard, somebody in the HOA dug them up and put them on their front porch.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so you have to be careful and make sure that you give them copies of covenants and restrictions. Okay. Review of zoning, that's us. We need to make sure that the property is properly zoned. We have a lot of historical homes down that have been converted to duplexes and quadplexes. And at some point, New Hanover County, because they wanted people to come downtown, they opened up and allowed these homes to be done. Now you got to make sure that that home was, one, approved, or that it falls into the grandfathering and they're allowing it, so that if your people are buying a house that they think they can use as a duplex, that it's legal. That happened during your due diligence process. The flip side of that is to make sure if you have a property that is zoned and it is converted, the tax records show it as a duplex, you're going to make sure that they're allowed to convert it back to single-family housing. Because there was a case of that with a VA loan where we couldn't get the house to appraise as a single-family dwelling because the tax record showed it as a duplex, and we could only get a certificate of reasonable value through VA as a duplex, and it wouldn't appraise. So you got to make sure that you follow all this and check your zoning. The other area right around us that you got to be careful of now is military cutoff extension. You know, because that's going right up through on the north side of Market Street, and you got to make sure that what property you're going to be going through Greenview Ranches. Some of that property is going to be rezoned into commercial, some of it's going to remain residential. So you need to make sure whenever you're listing property. Manny's got a form right here where there's a disclosure form that our company uses for as far as that, and that we have them sign that they're aware of it. Okay? And then during this period, you've done all your inspections. You've done everything you're supposed to do. Now what do you have to do before due diligence ends? You got to type up a repair request agreement and get all these repairs negotiated. You got to make sure that during your due diligence process that repairs are negotiated. Do they have to be completed?
No.
No, they do not have to be completed during your due diligence. But they got to make sure that before due diligence expires that you've negotiated any repairs that you want done. Questions? Anything up till now that y'all have on what we talked about? Everybody's good with that for as far as getting us through the inspections? Okay. We're going to talk somewhat now. We've gotten through. We've already talked about what we've done. We've talked about selecting your attorney. We've talked about what you've got to give the attorney. So everybody's good with all of that?
Yeah.
We talked about the due diligence process. We talked about what you have to do. We talked about as far as what your responsibility is for as far as assisting in all of this, for as far as making sure that you've reviewed covenant restrictions, that you've reviewed zoning, you've done all the stuff that we need to make sure and educate our buyers and sellers of this process. Sometimes it's not just the buyers who are confused. Sellers have no idea what is going on during this and what their responsibilities are. Sellers are supposed to make sure that we get copies of their deed, make sure we have copies of flood insurance policies. If they have them, they need to make sure they give us copies of title. There's all sorts of things that sellers are responsible for here. They need to understand the due diligence process and the fact that after the inspections are done, they might have to be paying some money. So we need to make sure that we educate and we do all of this. And then we've got to make sure the appraisal is done. And that should all happen during due diligence. Now, we're going to talk about things that happen after due diligence and before our closing, okay? One is, what's the attorney's first thing on his agenda when he gets a package?
Prepare a closing statement.
Prepare a closing statement. We're gonna do title search. All right, how many of you are aware of this title searches? What do they do? Is it one time?
No.
No. When an attorney does, and a lot of times people just think attorney does title search, boom, it's done. But believe it or not, there's a 3-stage process. They do a preliminary. Usually when they get a contract, they gotta do, because the lender, as soon as they receive a contract, the lender's gonna ask them for a preliminary title. And what that means is the attorney has to go in and verify, one, are there current liens on the property, how long have they owned the property for, and if there's any issues that they see right off the bat. Once they issue a preliminary to the lender, then the lender can move forward with underwriting. Typically, not all lenders do it the same way, but most. But they will do a preliminary search. Then during the due diligence process, the lender, before they, or after they go through that, then they're gonna do a full search. And during that full search, they're gonna go in and see anything that, for as far as clouds on the title, anything that could go back and hurt getting a new title insurance policy issued. And then after that, what they're gonna do is they write a letter, to the title company saying that the findings and everything's clear, and and the title insurance company's gonna give them a binder. And the binder is what we use for as far as moving forward to closing. So that is the first 2 steps. And then there's a final step we'll talk about in a little while. But those are the very first things they gotta make sure that they do. Any questions on title and what the attorneys are gonna be doing?
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Why do attorneys do a last minute check on the title?
Well, that's gonna be one of our next things we're gonna talk about. But the reason they do it is because after they've done their final search, their big search, and they've issued the binder, then what they do is after the closing table and before it's recorded, they do that final search before the policy is actually issued. So we got a binder right now, but there's no policy. They're gonna do a final search at that stage to make sure that between the time they search and the time they record, that there's been no other liens placed against the property. Because if anybody had work done on their home that maybe they didn't pay for, then they could have got a mechanic lien or anything put against the property. And believe it or not, that some of these people at some point in their life in the last few years could have had a foreclosure or a short sale, that even though they fall within the guidelines and they got a loan, that the previous bank found out. So what they want to do now, especially with the seller, is that they put a judgment against them, a deficiency judgment, to collect the money that is owed to them. So all of this shows up in that final title search before it's closed.
Okay.
So you just want to make sure that's what they're going to do, but that comes after the settlement. Those are your 3 stages. You got a preliminary, you got the binder stage, and then you got the final before the policy is issued. Okay? And then the attorney, besides that, they're going to check and do that, and then they're going to make sure to verify for as far as any mechanic lien. Are we good? Everybody got any questions concerning that part? The other thing they're going to do is make sure that all leases have been transferred correctly. If you got residential leases, they could have commercial leases based on whatever property you're buying, and you want to make sure that any lease is reassigned to the new buyer and that everybody's on board. Because the other thing you got to make sure of, we remember that residential leases, they don't have to be in writing for 3 years or less to be honored. And a seller, until they transfer the security deposit, who's still responsible?
The
The seller. You got to remember, the seller has 2 ways of relieving their liability on a lease. One is that they transfer the security deposit to the new buyer, and in the process of that, they do a written letter to the tenant that they have transferred it and that this is who their new landlord is. And 2 is that they just reimburse the security deposit to the tenant, and they no longer have security deposits involved. And they will release their liability when the property is transferred over. So make sure, and the attorney needs to make sure, this is part of their stuff, is to make sure that during this time frame that they make sure all this stuff has happened.
But title insurance is super important too, right?
Title insurance that is very important. You gotta have it for any loan. If you're borrowing money, you gotta have title insurance.
Right, so it's not just on the attorney, it's also on. title.
Well, the title insurance is not something that you and I are concerned with.
Okay.
We need to make sure that the attorney has done the title search and they have policy.
Okay,
But that's just us asking, but that's why you wanna make sure that you have an attorney that's real estate,
okay.
because they know what they're supposed to do. And if you find one, then you're gonna have to end up getting more involved in it. And then you come up, after you've done all of this, we've done all of the due diligence, we've done all the work is done, we might have had to go back out and do re-inspections. The attorney has done all of their stuff for as far as making sure title is issued, all this stuff is now in place. What's one of the last things that we have to make sure is done? Do a walkthrough.
Mhm.
Okay. As a walkthrough, do you realize that during due diligence that your buyer should actually do a really good physical walkthrough of the property? And that should be done during due diligence, something I should have mentioned earlier. Because you really want to make sure that, you know, a lot of times the buyers just kind of walk through, they love the house, they don't really pay attention to it. And during that due diligence period, you really want them to walk through that house and look at it. To make sure they do that. But now you're at the beginning, the last thing, you want to do a final walkthrough of the property and make sure that the property is the way it's supposed to be. It was as good or better as when we went through. You want to make sure that anything that was to be left behind has been left. You know, you want to make sure, I had one 2 weeks ago that the buyer or the seller, we had negotiated in the contract, they were going to take the chandelier out of the dining room
Mhm.
and they were going to replace it. We agreed to what they were going to replace it with. We went over there to do our walkthrough, and guess what was gone?
The chandelier.
Chandelier was gone, that was fine, it was supposed to. They replaced it, but they took the one out of the foyer.
Oh, they replaced it.
They replaced it, put another one in there, but it was nowhere near what the other one was. What they had in there was probably about a $400 or $500 chandelier, and they put up about a $35, $40 light fixture from Lowe's.
Oh,
Okay, so the very first thing that my buyer did when he walked in the door,
uh-huh.
where's the light fixture?
Oh.
I didn't notice it. I hadn't even noticed that there was a different one there. He didn't like the one in the dining room. He was fine when she wanted that one.
Right.
But he loved the one in the
Oh,
foyer.
no.
So we actually had to go in and renegotiate. We went through, did our walkthrough, and then I had to call the listing agent. And I had to tell her we got a problem. She said, oh, no, she didn't do that. I said, yes, she did. So she had to get off, she couldn't actually get on the phone and call because she wasn't allowed to take phone calls at work. She had to drive over to the place where the lady worked and go in and see her, and they had to get it worked out before we sat down at the closing table. And so we negotiated what was going to happen, and everything was fine. But those are the things that happened during that final thing. The other thing you have to do, earnest money. Where does earnest money go?
Goes to this seller.
It goes to the attorney
Okay.
from the person who had it in their trust account. You can physically pick up a check, take it to the attorney, go in there to their trust account, or, and most practices today, most people who have trust accounts, we hold the money in our trust account, and then when it's closed, we transfer it out of our trust account to the general fund, and then we can use it that way. A lot of times we just don't move checks back and forth, but the biggest thing is that if you're taking a check, you got to make sure that you can't do it prior to 10 days before closing. That if your closing is set for September 14th, you cannot take it September 1st.
Okay.
What happens if there's not a trust account? If an agency doesn't have a trust account, then who are we making the check out?
Yeah, a lot of companies today, especially the newer companies, have decided they don't want the trust account, they don't want to handle.
Yeah, like
and
small companies.
And
Yeah.
so typically in those accounts, you got a couple of things you can do. If your company that you work with has a trust account, the buyer can write the earnest money to that company and put it in their trust account, or they can write it to the closing attorney to go into their trust account. So either way that you wish to do that. But it's gonna either go to the attorney's trust account, or it's gonna go into your company's trust account. Any other questions on that earnest money? Earnest money is a big thing, because you wanna make sure it doesn't leave your trust account too soon. You wanna make sure it gets transferred out to the general fund when it's supposed to, in order for you to go through with closing. The other thing is the fact of what happened during this time. Y'all remember during RESPA, and you got TRIDS, because now in 2015, we no longer use HUD, we use a closing disclosure, which y'all remember that from pre-licensing. So we go into the TRID, and you gotta make sure that 3 days before closing, that your buyer has seen their closing disclosure and signed off on it. Now, keep in mind that not all lenders do a physical presentation of the closing disclosure for them to sign it. That there are other ways they can do it. They can mail it, they can email it, they can do different things, and they gotta do that 10 days out. Because the rule of thumb is the fact that they mail it, email it, that in 10 days they're going to have it. And that 10 days has to be 3 days before. So you're looking at actually mailing it at least 2 weeks before closing. So that they have what they call their 10 days. But you've got to stay in touch and work with your lender and make sure that this is being followed, whichever way that your lender is going to do it. But make sure that you review that closing disclosure with your buyer. If you're working with the seller, make sure that you get it and that you review the closing disclosure with your seller so they know what they paid and how much money they're getting. Hopefully all that was done and you had done a seller net sheet. They're pretty much aware of what they're going to get. But all of this should be done during this time before closing. Now, understand there is not a time frame given for seller CDs. Okay, seller CDs can come the same day. It's the buyer CD that is required 3 days prior to closing. And if we're doing a cash deal, you're still using the old HUD 1 statement. They do not go on closing disclosures. They still remain with the HUD and a commercial deal. Commercial and cash deals still use the HUD 1. Okay. Make sure that the title insurance is finally done here during this process, that the attorney's ready to move forward with the title insurance. And make sure that the closing package, if you look on page 452, we're getting near the end of what we're going to talk about right now, and then we're going to take a break. So what we're going to do is make sure that the package has been delivered to the attorney. Right, so you're staying in touch and working with the lender, making sure all the processes, they should have a clear close, and that the final package, the CD has been signed for, and make sure that the closing disclosure or the closing package goes to the attorney so that you can go in and do the settlement. Okay? Any questions during this? Because once the settlement occurs and they do this, then there's then the attorney's going to make sure they do the final search on title, and then they can record, and then they can disperse funds. And at disbursement of funds is when your buyer, they get to move into their new home, and they get to say thank you for helping them, and the seller is going to collect their funds, and they're going to be very happy because they can move on to do their things. But just make sure that everything is running smoothly. The biggest thing is that we, as brokers, stay involved. Stay involved, make sure that we keep everything on track and we know what we're supposed to do, and educate our buyers and sellers of the process between here and there. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to take a real quick break, but we need to make sure, one, is that based on your buyers and sellers' experience, that we keep them abreast, make sure that all the due diligence is done, make sure we've negotiated repairs, all the repairs were done, and make sure that we do the final walkthrough, make sure that all this stuff is done. And now what we're going to do, we're going to take a real quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss the closing procedures and settlements and talk more about all the title insurance. Now, I'm also going to be giving you a game when we get back. And it's a crossword puzzle that I want y'all to work on when you come back in. You can work in groups, you can do it individually, but I want y'all to work on this, and then we're going to talk about the answers on it when you get back. All right? Thank y'all very much.